In October 1929, two men sat down in Vienna for what looked, on the surface, like a routine meeting between a chancellor and a banker. Johann Schober, the Austrian chancellor, had requested the audience. Baron Louis von Rothschild, 48 years old, lean, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you hold something the other man needs, received him. The conversation was polite. It was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. Because what Schober was asking Louis to absorb was not a struggling competitor. It was a country's open wound, dressed in a balance sheet. The Creditanstalt, Vienna's dominant bank, already controlled roughly 69% of all Austrian limited companies. Think about that number for one moment. If this institution failed, Austria did not have a banking crisis. Austria ceased to function. The Creditanstalt was not too big to fail. It was too big to exist without the state watching its every move, and too important for the state to ever let it walk away. The Rothschilds had spent over a century engineering against exactly this kind of trap. In 1810, the founder had distributed his 5 sons across London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Naples, and built the family's financial architecture around one iron principle. No single government could seize more than 20% of the total family fortune at once. The design was not generosity. It was armor. A government could threaten one branch. It could never threaten the whole. But armor has a weakness when the man wearing it is also the last wall standing between a nation and collapse. The London branch did not merely hold gold. They owned the refinery that stamped the bars. The Rothschilds had not just built a bank. They had built the infrastructure that every other bank depended on to survive. That is not power. That is leverage the government can eventually point back at you. The mechanism has not changed in 100 years. If you are the strongest institution in the room, the state will eventually decide that your strength is a public resource. The Creditanstalt merger was not a business decision. It was forced into service. The meeting in Vienna lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the Creditanstalt had agreed to absorb the Boden-Credit-Anstalt, and with it, an estimated 60 million shillings in immediate losses that the acquiring bank had not generated, had not approved, and could not refuse. Chancellor Schober had not asked. He had informed. The strongest private bank in Austria had just been drafted like a soldier into carrying a wound that belonged to the state. But while Vienna was being handed a liability it could not survive, London was running a different machine entirely. Since 1919, the NM Rothschild bank offices at New Court had hosted the London gold fixing, a twice-daily ritual in which the global benchmark price for gold was set, in that room, by the men seated at that table. Anthony de Rothschild, 44 years old, broad-shouldered, the London branch's operational anchor, understood what that seat meant. Currency collapses in Vienna, Berlin, Budapest. None of it touched the fixing. The price was set in London. The chaos was everywhere else. The fixing was not the ceiling of the operation. It was the floor. Below it sat the Royal Mint Refinery, a facility the family controlled outright, processing 12 million ounces of gold through its furnaces in 1932 alone, running 3 shifts around the clock to meet the demand. Every bar that came out carried a stamp. That stamp was not decoration. It was a toll. The intelligence moved faster than the gold. The London branch maintained a private courier network threading between European capitals, faster than the official state postal services, faster than the telegraph in certain corridors. A banking house that knew a government's credit position before the government's own treasury had finished counting did not need to speculate. It simply needed to be ready. The couriers did not carry money. They carried the information that determined what money was worth. And when the governments themselves began to crack, when they needed to restructure their national debts or face default. The London branch was already positioned as their advisor. They did not merely survive the era of collapsing states. They sent them the bill. A bank that profits from national debt restructuring, while its Vienna branch absorbs a nation's banking losses, is not caught between two worlds. It has engineered a position in both. By May 1931, the merger had detonated. The Austrian government's guarantee for the Creditanstalt had reached 1.2 billion shillings, nearly 70% of the entire national budget. The state had not rescued a bank. It had consumed itself trying. Austria had handed all its spare cash to a single institution, and that institution was still falling. The conscription that began in a polite Vienna meeting room had ended with a government eating its own reserves to slow a collapse it had engineered. On September 21st, 1931, Britain walked off the gold standard. Overnight, no warning. The price of gold in London jumped 40% in a single session, and every bar sitting in the Royal Mint Refinery's inventory revalued upward with it. While the Austrian state was rationing its last budget reserves to hold a failing bank together, the London operation was recording one of the largest single-session asset inflations in its history. Same family, opposite directions. The architecture had worked exactly as designed. Then came 1938, the Anschluss, and the state that had spent 9 years extracting value from Louis von Rothschild's balance sheet came back for the man himself. He was detained at the Hotel Metropole in Vienna, the Gestapo's operational headquarters, for approximately 1 year. The restricted correspondence from that period has never been fully released. What is confirmed is this: his freedom was purchased. The ransom has never been officially settled. The figures in circulation run from $10 million to $21 million. Gone. Here is the mechanism that has not changed. When you are the strongest institution in any system, the bank, the fund, the infrastructure operator, the government does not protect you. It uses you. Your strength becomes a public utility the moment a crisis requires it. In 2008, Washington did not ask the owners of the bank Bear Stearns for permission. In 2023, the Swiss government did not ask the bank UBS. The balance sheet of the strong is always the state's first reserve when the weak begin to fail. In 1998, the Austrian government returned over 200 looted art objects to the Rothschild family, settling a legal claim that had remained open for 59 years. 59 years to recover what was taken and won. The vault had been emptied, the man had been ransomed, and the bank had been forced into carrying a nation's wound, all within a decade. The ransom that purchased Louis von Rothschild's freedom, somewhere between $10 million and $21 million, the exact figure still disputed, was not the cost of his release. It was the final invoice on a balance sheet the state had been running against him since October 1929. If you are building something the government cannot afford to let fail, understand that the government has already decided it belongs to them. Subscribe to Leviathan Files. Every case we document is a mechanism that is still running.